Yeah, we're going to make everything out of hemp is an example of phrases that are, we can make 25,000 things. But the reality is we're going to have to make one thing first and prove its viability in the marketplace before we talk about number two product. Starting off with we can make 25,000 things right now turns people off.
That's Bill Althouse, hemp pioneer and industry philosopher. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock. Welcome back to our show. So Bill Althouse has been described as an expert and a maverick. He's been called many things by many people over the long arc of his career that spans agriculture, engineering, green building, renewable energy, advising policymakers, setting up farmer co-ops, and more. He brings deep experience and a valuable perspective to the conversations around hemp. I see him as a voice in the wilderness, saying things here today that maybe the hemp industry isn't ready or willing to hear just yet. But I suggest we listen to him. He makes a lot of sense. This is a long interview covering many topics, from the R value of hempcrete to the value chain of hemp for textiles to the interesting potential of lignin-first technology. But Bill's main message is legitimization, by which he means that hemp must meet all of the rules, regulations, material specifications, and testing standards of the non-hemp materials we're trying to replace with hemp. Before we get into the interview, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, IND Hemp, Westtown Bank, and Amerishon Cast Hemp. I am grateful for your continuing support. All right, let's talk to Bill. Bill Althouse, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, fair, except for coming down with COVID over the holiday weekend.
Oh, good times. Yeah, I've been there myself. I'm sorry to hear that, but I appreciate you rallying for this call.
Well, hemp was always an inspiring conversation for me.
Good. Well, I feel like we're about to embark on an inspiring conversation. So I wonder if you could just, give me an introduction. Tell me who you are, where you've been, why, how you got into the hemp industry.
I'm a old retired energy engineer, long career in energy performance contracting, renewables, cogeneration, energy performance in buildings, building science, all of that. And I kind of retired a while back, and then my hobby, which my engineering company supported, was farming. I grew dahlias and strawberries and sold them at the Santa Fe Farmers Market, and won the county fair for these wild French strawberries that I grew. And the next weekend, a group walked up to my booth in Santa Fe and, "So, you're a real farmer?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know about that. I have to subsidize my farm, but I enjoy it quite a bit." And they go, "Well, we're looking for a farmer. We just got one of the first marijuana grow licenses in the country. New Mexico was an early state with medical marijuana. And we're looking for a grower. Do you know anything about cannabis?" And actually, I did. I'm old. And anyway, they wanted me to help them. And I had just read an article from Israel about Meshulam and his boys treating some patients with a new variety of cannabis that wasn't psychoactive and had great success. Treating some really, bad condition, dementia, late stage folks, and really getting some improvements to quality of life. And I found it fascinating. So, I told the guys, well, I'm really interested in this new variety of cannabis that can't get anyone high that seems to have some pretty incredible medical properties. And if you
what year was this? Sorry to interrupt.
This was about 15 years ago.
Okay.
So basically, I'm curious about this. If you pay for my R&D, I'll build your grow for you. So we made a deal, and that was the arrangement. I would create their production facility, and in exchange, they would fund my R&D into this. Their reaction was kind of strange. They're going, "We just got a license to grow marijuana, and you want to grow shit that can't get anyone high? What's wrong with you?" Well, long story short,
it's a fair question, I guess.
It took me a while, but we became the first CBD producers commercially in the United States.
Wow.
Early days. Then I moved to Colorado once I saw the handwriting on the wall that hemp was going to become a source because marijuana is too expensive. And came to Colorado and got very involved in testifying at the legislature during drafting of the rules for both hemp and marijuana. And when the law finally passed and regs went into effect, I was standing outside the office of the CDA at 6 a.m. waiting for them to open at 9 to make sure I was the first registrant in Colorado to grow hemp. And that's kind of what started the hemp journey, was that beginning. And now here we are today with a massive green rush, total market collapse. Nationwide, hemp is really down, almost out. Mexico has 190 acres in the ground. Texas has 2,000. Most other states that were big, here in Colorado, we went from 2,700 registrants down to about 200 this year. So interesting time, but I'm very hopeful that fiber might be one of the ways to bring hemp back into the real world.
Right.
And we'll see.
So a couple of weeks ago, I was interviewed by Mandy Kerr on the Global Hemp Association's show, Moving Hemp Forward. And you happened to catch that live YouTube stream. And later that day, you sent me a very thoughtful email, a little contentious in some areas, but I read it on last week's show in its entirety. And the point of it that you're making is legitimization. So let's get into that.
Legalization was a big step, and it took a lot of effort from a lot of people and a lot of advocates and people who were tireless over a really long time to get over that hurdle. But now, once we're over the hurdle of legalization, the next one is going to be, more technical, more based in engineering, more complex, and that is legitimization, which is to be able to approach a principal in a target industry, a buyer of materials, whatever industry that is, and be able to show that individual that hemp can meet all the rules, regulations, material specifications, and testing standards that the materials they're buying now have to meet. And so this legitimization has really nothing to do with hemp and 100% to do with what the buyers of materials and these industries need to hear to be able to consider a material. And after legitimization, of course, becomes competition. So we need to be able to do all that and then be able to do it with higher performance and a lower cost than those materials. Of course, the first step is the rules, regs, specs, tests, and that's been pretty hard for a lot of folks. It's, you've got to play at expert level in the target industry, and knowing what that is has been a challenge for a lot of folks. What are the specs? What are the rules? What are the regs? What are the tests? And then to make sure that the hemp product in question can do all those things.
And do you think that hemp can do all of those things? It can compete? It can deliver higher performance at a lower price?
Can we meet rules, regs, and specs and tests? Yeah, that's looking feasible in a number of industries. The bigger challenge, after dotting I's and T crossing and getting the attention of the principals in those target industries, will be doing it cheaper and better than the material they're specifying now. Like take the textile industry right now, cotton is king. And we're going to have to meet the same specs that a cotton fiber meets and then find a way to do it cheaper and better. Very challenging, cheaper and better, because the value chains are much more difficult for hemp than they are for cotton.
Well, walk us through the value chain on cotton and then compare that to hemp.
Cotton, all the infrastructure is built for cotton. The harvesting machines, the field planting, harvesting, transport, spinning equipment, it's all targeted at cotton. So if you're producing cotton, what comes from the field can be, pretty easily made into product, because all the infrastructure exists and it works very well with cotton fibers.
Is there anything you have to do to cotton, like before you can spin it into thread?
Very little. It comes from the field almost ready to spin. There is some cleanup and making sure you don't have contaminants, but for the most part, it comes from the field spinnable. Now, hemp is a different critter. Hemp requires field retting, which is highly weather dependent and variable and often picks up dirt from the ground, contaminating. And then conventional wisdom is you need to decorticate it to get the bast bundles out of the stock, which are not yet a fiber. Decorticator can't produce a finished fiber. It produces a raw bast bundle of fibers glued together with lignin. Then you need a secondary facility to delignify those fibers, to get individual free-floating fibers with no remaining lignin. That's what you would have to be able to spin a hemp fiber. And also they need to be cut. All the spinning equipment, if we're going to try to get into the cotton supply chains, use short fibers, and hemp's a long fiber. So now there's chopping that needs to be done in order to get the fibers the right lengths. So when you're looking at the two, cotton versus hemp, one has a very complex supply chain and cotton doesn't. So that's a very big challenge to have all that capital equipment, all that processing, chemicals, yada, yada, everything in the middle between the field and the spinner that cotton doesn't need.
Okay. So yeah, I see the challenges there. And so in the email that you wrote, you talk about how the people in the hemp space aren't quite ready to be legitimate. Like there's this talk of you say right here, hemp is not magic and agriculture is a tough business. And many people keep repeating myths and unrealistic ideas that make the non-hemp people disregard hemp as delusional, doing great damage to the future of hemp. So what, people in other industries are wary of hemp folk?
Well, hemp folks need to understand the mind of the target buyer. The target buyer in the industries, whether we're talking construction materials or textiles or, the long list of the 25,000 products that hemp people like to say we're going to make from hemp, just go to those people in the industries that make the decisions about what material they use and be able to talk with them in a way that you can show you understand their needs and requirements. and that you're willing to meet them. So often we're talking about engineering types. They're 1 and 1 equals 2 people. There's no leaps of faith in people doing engineering due diligence. And so you've got to really understand what their needs are, what the rules and regs and specs and tests are, and make sure you can meet those without using any of the language that causes negative reactions. We're going to change the world with hemp. Well, people in ag or in industry know they're in tough businesses. And so there's no magic wands. It's hard work. There's technical standards to be met. And it's the language that oversells. There's an old phrase in industry which is, under promise and over deliver. And the impression of the folks in industry are that the hemp folks are over promising and under delivering without an understanding of what the buyer's needs are.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, we're going to make everything out of hemp is an example of phrases that are, we can make 25,000 things. But the reality is we're going to have to make one thing first and prove its viability in the marketplace before we talk about number 2 product. Starting off with we can make 25,000 things right now turns people off.
Well, that comes from that 1937 Popular Mechanics article, right? Everyone's quoting that, and then it was made illegal the following year. So,
yeah, and it's funny you brought up that article. I reread it the other day.
Yeah.
And it wasn't saying that crop made $1 billion. It was predicting that there was the potential for hemp to become a significant crop.
Oh, yeah, that's how I read it too.
Yeah, and a lot of people quote that article as we were there and they took it all away. No, we weren't there. If you look at actual acreages planted in that time frame, there was very little hemp being grown.
Right. By the early 1800s, hemp had started to fade, with Eli Whitney's cotton gin and the atrocities of slavery in the South. There was no chance for hemp to compete with cotton as a textile. And by the early 20th century, it was essentially non-existent.
Hemp makes great rope and canvas. It doesn't make a great T-shirt. And that's why cotton took over. It's finer, softer. It's really how it feels against your skin is why hemp faded away. And it wasn't very significant anyway. It had a niche market. Definitely rope, sail canvas way, way back because it degraded slower. But in terms of the 25,000 things that are claimed we can make, very few of those were ever made from hemp.
Sure. But that's where we are now. Like now we have new technologies and we could make a lot more with hemp. Like I think we should be making lots of things just with plants in general, right? Sort of move away from, the extractive model of fossil fuels and get into the regenerative model where we're growing our raw materials rather than digging them out of the ground.
True that. And, target markets, when I first started dealing with non-hemp textile engineers. We're at ASTM setting material standards for the industry right now for hemp fibers. And we were getting input from the department, the committee at ASTM D13 that sets specs for all natural and synthetic fibers. And hemp isn't at that committee because, number one, we're bast glued together with lignin, got to get the lignin off. There's a number of reasons why we don't meet D13 specs of what a fiber is. And some of them are pretty elemental and problematic. I guess the major one, as we set our metrics on how to measure the qualities of a fiber. Diameter, stiffness, softness, fineness, color, coefficient of friction, cohesion. We have all these metrics that we're measuring and developing laboratory standards to measure and be able to rate fibers, and feedback from textile engineers, not hemp people, but the people in the textile industry, were able to say some really illuminating things like a hemp fiber is too large a diameter and it's too stiff to spin a fine thread. So that 100% soft hemp shirt is unlikely based on the fiber we've seen. Now, the problem, I think, is that fiber is harvested very late. And as the plant matures and gets older, the fiber diameter increases, stiffness increases, it becomes less fine, supple. So we've got a project this year looking at baby hemp to see if agronomy and variety can look at an earlier cut. For example, is the fiber a smaller diameter?
Right.
Is the diameter small enough to be able to spin that fine thread? I agree that if we could make a T-shirt out of hemp, it would get enough acres in the ground to make hemp a viable crop. But a soft, supple T-shirt, the brass ring, is out of reach at the moment.
I remember reading somewhere about, it might have been in the Jack Herer book, Emperor Wears No Clothes, about like maybe there was these old documents from farms here, from colonial America, where they were talking about, for certain kinds of thread, you wanted to plant it at this density and, have like real thin, tall, spindly plants versus, different kinds of things. So I feel like that's an example of the knowledge that we lost from Prohibition.
We've been fortunate lately at ASTM. We have all the textile engineers, the heads of the industry, and the labs in China joining us, trying to create harmony with standards internationally. In that process, we're able occasionally to ask some questions that's really out of our purview. We're looking at finished fibers, but we've been able to ask about some of the agronomy and variety side of the Chinese industry. And they plant at ultra high densities and they cut early.
Okay. But they still have toxic degumming and retting ponds, right? Like their hemp textile industry is terrible.
They do, and that's one of another major obstacles here. Everyone who's tried to get a degumming permit from the EPA has failed because of the effluent toxicity. So, but in terms of getting to that fiber, and I guess the best hemp textiles do come out of China, and the key is they cut early, and I didn't really get a cut date, how many days from germination, but I know this, as we look at the stem's maturity, both the main stem and the individual fibers have lumen. So in the beginning, that stem is hollow. It grows like a straw, like wheat straw. And as it matures and gets older, that lumen begins to fill in. And even when you go to scanning electron microscope cross sections, and you look at the individual fibers themselves, they are also hollow tubes that fill in during maturity, making those individual fibers larger diameters and stiffer. So when I asked the Chinese guy what their herd market in China was, he explained how early they cut. He said, "We have no herd. No herd."
No herd. They cut it before that.
Yes. So, and we're seeing that. And when the scan, I just saw my first scanning electron microscope, SEM in jargon. a while back as I was starting to put together this baby hemp study, and you can really see the circulatory system of the plant. The fiber is in the phloem tissue, and then the core is xylem. And xylem, it's, veins and arteries pretty much of the plant. Those individual fibers are tubes in the phloem, and they're the water, the circulatory system returning to the roots. The xylem is the circulatory system going from the roots to the top. So, xylem's kind of like arteries, and fiber is kind of like the veins of the circulatory system. And in the SEM microscope cross sections, you can see all the fibers are actually hollow. That was actually new to me. I thought I knew the stem was hollow, but finding out that the individual fibers themselves are hollow really explained to me the circulatory system. They're tubes. They're pipes. Each individual fiber is, and because of that structure, with a tubular wall and a hollow core, you can see how wall thickness is going to affect stiffness in a radical way. So that cell wall of the individual fiber tube itself needs to be thinner. And a lot of the shots I saw came from flax, which is very similar. So a study was done on flax, like we're doing this year in hemp, to look at the shifts in morphology throughout the growth cycle. And it was stark how in the beginning the cell wall was very thin, and the lumen, the hollow core, was a very large percentage of the total cross-section. And as it ages, you can see the cell wall get thicker and thicker and thicker, making it stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. So I'm very hopeful that agronomy and variety can figure out how hemp can produce the fiber. Now, there's going to be some trade-offs. I was in the call with Texas A&M yesterday, and we were talking about baby hemp and the trade-offs. Most hemp fiber studies have been, what's the tons per acre at maturity? Well, the baby hemp study is going to be, what is your tons per acre that have the highest value to the textile industry? And then what's the trade-off? If we're getting, twice as much per ton, you can grow half as many tons, and it's the same as growing the high production at a low value. And hopefully we're going to be able to try to figure out at what point the farmer would have the highest value per acre by selling to someone who can make that brass ring t-shirt or selling to someone who can only make rope.
So maybe textile isn't the way to go with hemp at this point? You were talking about of the 25,000 uses, we just need one success. So should the energy be somewhere else, or do you think it's good that various people are just looking at all the different aspects of what can be made?
The major stumbling block is getting fiber out of the stock.
Okay.
That's the number one overhead cost that's excessive for hemp compared to other fibers.
Right.
So in terms of making products, value chain analysis, there's a lot of people talk supply chain. And as an engineer, I love supply chain talk. How can you get there from here? And with a bunch of smart engineers and enough capital, you can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. However, it'll cost more than if you just made a silk purse.
Right.
From silk. So that's the real challenge, is to stop thinking how to build a supply chain to get us from the field to a fiber, and think more about the value chain of how that's achieved. And value chains are pretty simple. Pick a product, any product, no matter what it is, textile, construction materials, long list. Pick anything out of our 25,000 things that we can make. And then look at what product is being purchased today that isn't made out of hemp. And what price are they getting? What's the value of that product? And that'll tell you what you can charge for your hemp replacement of that product, whatever it is. And then you go to the other end of the equation. And the farmer, who has been, way too many farmers have been burnt with hemp's wild promises, and buyers didn't show. It's happened in a lot of attempts at fiber. CBD was a total industrial collapse where buyers didn't show or didn't exist. And in order to get farmers to plant, you need to know what the farmer's minimum net is in order to get him to switch. How much does he have to make per acre? So now you have your bookends of a value chain. You know what you got to pay the farmer, and you know the price of the existing product that you need to beat with your hemp product. Now you've got your bookends on a value chain. So rather than the supply chain thinking, which is fun for an engineer, we got to do more economic analysis when we look at a technology, a process, a piece of equipment, the distance of transportation from a processing plant, all these elements. We've got to make sure that the whole thing can fit between the two bookends of your supply chain. And so right now, I've looked at a number of potential products and what we would have to do to beat that price to get the buyer of those products willing to take a look. And I can't find, in at least the fiber space, how a decorticator and a degumming facility fits between the bookends of a viable value chain.
Because it just adds a lot of cost.
Yeah, like we talked about in cotton.
Yeah.
We want to compete with cotton. Cotton fiber is the material we want to compete with. So, getting the same performance specs, first of all, is a challenge, but even more so is to be able to get that fiber to a spinner at a competitive price against cotton. If we have to decorticate and degum, and, environmental permitting, and the list kind of goes on and on. One of the things that really jumps out as you develop an industry was how bad laying the stalks on the ground and picking them back up are to machinery down the road. If you need to cut those fibers to shorter lengths, and they're tough fibers to cut anyway, and you get even a small amount of dirt on those stalks, what happens is, and I've talked to a number of folks around the world that have tried to cut dried, field-retted hemp stalks, and pretty much it's failure. The machine either gets dull so quickly that it's unviable, your downtime exceeds your runtime because you're changing blades, or those dull blades generate heat and the machine caught fire and was destroyed.
Yikes.
So it's just a simple thing that, a lot of people don't see. If you lay it on the ground, you pick up dirt. So that was one monkey wrench in a potential value chain. Downtime destroys a value chain.
Right.
If you can't run, at a high capacity factor in your processing facility, you can't have a viable value chain. And it just took a little bit of dirt to make it really difficult to be able to cut the fibers to a spinnable length.
Right. Well, how about the herd? How about we talk about hempcrete?
Hempcrete is the most problematic right now.
Oh, yeah? And why is that?
The construction industry is very highly regulated. And so far, about legitimization, hempcrete has failed to adhere to any rule, reg, material spec, or testing standard in the construction industry. Not 100%. It did pass a fire test, but it's cementitious. I wasn't concerned whether it would burn or not. But other than the burn test, hempcrete really hasn't met any of the specs or performance standards that are mandatory. And ASTM, for example, sets material specs. I've been on the C16 committee, insulation, ASTM, since the 90s. And it's a mature industry. And what that means at ASTM, when you say it's a mature industry, when you go to the materials committee for that material, you'll see that the head engineer of every manufacturer and the head engineer of every buyer of that material is on the committee, working together to achieve consensus about the standards that assay the value of that material. So in insulation, the manufacturer and the buyer both need to be quite confident about what the R value is. That's the goal of insulation, is to give you energy efficiency. So a buyer, a major construction company, wants a house with low energy costs. Okay. So they need to be very confident that when they measure the R value of a material, that it's accurate. Same thing with the seller. And this is also elemental to the ability of an industry to be able to write a contract. So a manufacturer of insulation and a buyer of insulation will agree on what the test being used in the R value has to be. And if there's any problem down the road, litigation's quite simple. You test a sample. If it met spec, the buyer's wrong. If it didn't meet spec, the seller's wrong. And this is universal at ASTM for all materials. Industry can't operate unless a buyer and a seller can agree about what the contract covers. And only specs can do that. So ordinarily at ASTM, the two sides agree to use that standard by consensus. However, in some cases, insulation being one of them, that the ASTM standard is actually codified into law. In the energy business, during the 70s spike and again in the 90s when natural gas prices spiked and people were suffering, little ladies saw their heating bill go from $100 to $500, wiping out their Social Security check. They became prey for fraud. People who were selling, magic materials that would cut your heating bill in half. And the Federal Trade Commission responded to all that fraud with a very heavy law. Rule 460, it's the R value rule, and it was imposed. And so this is an example where the ASTM standard isn't just a consensus agreement between a buyer and a seller. It's actually federal law. And the rule is very severe. And it doesn't just cover the material and the testing of the material. It covers marketing, labeling. Even simple statements are under the FTC R value rule. So back to hempcrete. If someone right now, and no hempcrete material has had its R value tested as far as I know, and I'm the liaison from the hempcrete committee to the C16 insulation committee at ASTM, and I've asked every advocate starting over 10 years ago, for results on R value on hempcrete. My background is extensive in building science. I'm also on the Building Science Committee, EO6, ASTM, which is where modeling and energy projections and performance and durability standards for buildings are set. And helped pioneer the EPA Energy Star program. And constructions, you got to get a building permit, number one. So to get a building permit, you have to comply with the R value minimum. Well, the FTC law applies to everyone, including inspectors and trade organizations, contractors, architects, installers. Pretty much everyone's covered. So in order to meet the R value minimum in a building code and get a permit, you're going to have to submit R value testing results that were mandated by the Federal Trade Commission. There's only 4 C16 ASTM tests specified in the R value rule. And to get a building permit, you would have to show that data. And if you don't get a building permit, then you can't get a mortgage or insurance. Now, there are a lot of jurisdictions that allow owner-builder exemption, where you could build a house that did not meet code, but you can't get a mortgage or insurance, and if you go to sell it, you're required to disclose it didn't meet code, and the buyer can't get a mortgage or insurance.
Then how are they building hempcrete houses now if they're essentially illegal? Is that what you're saying?
Well, a contractor can't touch it because he has to meet code. So a regular licensed contractor can't touch it. An owner-builder building out of pocket in many jurisdictions can get an exemption to code. So, often I've heard a couple hemp advocates say that their building got a permit. Well, it got a permit under an exemption to requiring a permit. That's not the same as getting a permit.
Okay.
So the test, and as liaison between the committees, I went to the C16 installation and talked with the guys who have the certified laboratories to do that testing, and I brought them back to our hempcrete committee and had him explain the steps, including the Federal Trade Commission law and how dangerous the fines are to not do the test and call a material insulation. And the end result is they didn't submit a sample. So, the scientific method here is very clear, and the testing engineer kind of threw up his hands. He's going, this is a new material. What you do is you submit a sample for testing and you look at the result. And if you don't like the result, then we can talk about sample prep and differences in mixes and run it again. But until you start testing different mixes, you're not moving the industry at all. You're dead in the water. And so one of the obstacles is hempcrete people think that they should have the right to mix hempcrete however they want. Well, the problem is that means the R value for every mix would be different, and the data from anybody else's work can't be used. Take concrete for an example. That's the CO9 committee of ASTM. Now, extensive testing, well-developed industry, very mature. All the concrete engineers and all the buyers of concrete engineers are on the committee. They've settled the details. And there's standardized mixes. So a concrete mixing company uses the exact recipe from a compression test of a concrete sample. So as long as he's using that exact recipe, then he can use the compressive strength that was established in multiple tests of that recipe.
So why wouldn't the hempcrete people just, create standards? Isn't that what they're trying to do?
The standards aren't creatable. They're already set in stone by the FTC. What you have to do is test your material to that standard and specify a given mix.
Yeah, that's what I meant, like a standard mix, right? Can't they? Yeah.
Exactly. As long as, and I hate to say it, but as long as the position is that hempcrete people can mix it however they want, the chances of ever getting a building permit or getting a mortgage or any of those things in real construction is about zero.
Well, didn't they get approved for an ICC code?
The IRC, they submitted a petition to the IRC for consideration of adding an addendum to the IRC. Now, I've been in the regulatory arena for a long time, and, the regulatory body accepts a petition, and then they're going to review it and then submit a response. So when the IRC review committee voted to accept the petition for consideration, it got reported as it got accepted into the code. That's not true.
No, I don't mean when I reported on it, I didn't say that got it accepted in there, but they were waiting for some kind of, statement from the IRC. I think they said that might come out in September, but it would just sort of like cross that first threshold towards approval. That's how I understood that.
I think it would have been very good if the people submitting the petition to the IRC had read the IRC code before they submitted. I don't think they really did, because if you read the IRC or the International Conservation Code or the UBC, any code, you'll see all of them defer to the FTC as the definition of insulation. So it's in the code. If you go to the section in the IRC, insulation, it's going to give you a reference to statute, which is the R-value law of the FTC.
Well, what about hempcrete builders in other countries? Like, from what I understand, France has a pretty well-developed, hempcrete building industry, and they're not, looking at the FTC, are they? They're not held accountable to that. They've got their own sets of rules and regulations.
A lot of it's running under exemption, and I think there's not near as many hempcrete houses as advocates like to think, like it's happening everywhere. They're building them everywhere. That's not true. There's some getting built, yes, no doubt. Almost always under exemptions to code, not by adhering to code.
That's interesting.
That's a big difference. Going head to head with your competing insulation is what I want to do. I want to take on fiberglass bats and come up with some way of building things that perform better. One of the real difficulties with, putting so much energy behind hempcrete is look at the marketplace. We're talking about targeting what you're replacing. So if you look at the construction industry, you can't replace fiberglass insulation in a frame house. So what does that mean? If your target, which is insulation, is what hempcrete's being represented as, and you're going to compete with insulation, well, 95% of all houses are stick frame with some kind of insulation between the studs. Very hard to directly replace the fiberglass bat with hempcrete.
See, I thought it just eliminated the need for it, like the mass of the wall and the air pockets within the mix creates that, wall that then doesn't need insulation.
Well, you highlighted on one of the major presentations of hempcrete folks that turn off every building science, every energy engineer in the world.
Yeah, what's that?
That is, a material cannot be both mass and insulation. So those statements, and it was included in the IRC petition. It's in every statement about hempcrete. It's on the Hemp Builders Association's website. It's on every individual's website. Every proponent makes the same claim that a material can be both thermal mass and insulation. And I'm sorry, that violates the laws of thermodynamics. When people keep asserting the same thing over and over again, that causes anyone in the field to completely disregard you as crazy, that's not a good thing.
Right.
And that's one of the ones that every time I hear it, I try to explain that it can't be both sunny and dark at the same time. I mean, can you have a bright sunny day and a pitch black night at the same time? No. And heat flows are kind of like photons. I mean, you got them or you don't. And how materials absorb and give back heat. The formula for how you model thermal mass and how you measure insulation are radically different. Radically so. Because they're different principles of thermodynamics.
So are you saying that like a hempcrete house wouldn't, like if it's wintertime and I'm in my hempcrete house, it wouldn't retain heat? Like it would be cold in there? Like the insulation, I mean, I don't understand why.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I'm not a science guy, so I don't get the thermodynamic argument.
A good insulation with a high R value typically has almost no mass, pounds per cubic foot. Typically as mass, pounds per cubic foot, goes up, conductance goes up, and R value goes down. So the best insulations have very little mass. And prevent heat flow. So you're in the take the C518 test, which is the test hempcrete should do. You have a sample, you apply heat to one side, and then you measure how long it takes for the heat to come out the other side.
Okay.
All right. So an ideal insulation, you can get one side way, way hot, and the heat will never come through. That's a great insulation.
Yeah.
However, if you're modeling mass, you need mass to penetrate the material. The best mass would be when the heat shows up on the other side of the wall. The fastest the wall can hold is a function of density. Like take concrete, vary a lot of pounds per cubic foot, can hold a lot of heat. But as the mass drops, the heat potential drops. So what mass does and what insulation does are really the opposites of each other. One needs to absorb heat and the other one needs to prevent absorption of heat. So if a material is claimed to be both, and you measure it, it will show up as a very poor storing mass and a very poor insulator. If it has characteristics of both, it will be a poor insulator and a poor heat storage mass. Now, we found this out. I worked with Oak Ridge Laboratories, and in terms of mass modeling, Los Alamos National Labs, the first modeling platform for thermal mass was called Transis, and it was developed there. I knew the engineer. And in the early days of passive solar in New Mexico, we were trying to model how adobe, masonry, floors absorb and release heat. Well, the first thing we noticed, and a characteristic of all passive houses, is they were very cold in the morning and they were really hot in the afternoon. And this is with thermocouples buried in the walls. So we were actually reading how heat penetrates these walls, how deep it goes, what the energy density of those walls are, and how it returned. And it was pretty obvious that you have to have temperature differential or heat can't move. So if you want to put heat into mass, if the room is 72 degrees and the wall is 72 degrees, no heat can move. Zero, not a single BTU can move. And the rate that heat moves is multiplied by the temperature difference. So if your room temp is only 80 and your wall temp is 72, you multiply the heat transfer by 8. However, if the temperature spikes to 100, now you're multiplying the heat transfer by 30 to get heat into that wall. And it's the same in reverse. For that wall to deliver heat back to the room, you've got to have a temperature differential to get the flow. And so as that temperature drops, more and more heat can be released. And so as it gets really cold, the temp drops and definitely goes into the 40s. So this was the standard operating range of all passive solar adobes. It was close to 100 in the afternoon and in the low 40s in the morning. But that was critical to even be able to get the mass to perform its ability to store and re-deliver that heat back to the space. And so the comfort, when we were doing EPA Energy Star, we also guaranteed comfort in writing, which was defined as no space in the house ever gets more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit off the thermostat setting. There was no cold spots in the house. So mass has to violate that. If you're going to really use mass effectively, you've got to have the swings. Now, there are attempts to try to eliminate the swings, like changing which side of the wall absorbed heat, like trom walls. Very interesting. Where you put the glazing over the adobe wall on the outside. And then you heat that wall, and it's coming through the wall into the space. And then in that case, you were overheating the outside, not the inside, and you got the temperature differential you needed to get heat into the wall, but the internal temp still had to drop low. So we were able to temper the way too hot in the day, but we weren't able to really fix the temperature needing to drop in the morning to be able to get heat out of that wall.
Yeah, I feel like you're poking holes in the whole concept of hempcrete building. Do you think that it's not even worth developing, or like what should people take away from what you're saying?
Back to legitimization. Every time you call hempcrete insulation, per statement, it's an $11,000 fine.
From the FTC?
Per statement, okay? Every time you say it, it's another $11,000. So I think, first of all, anybody who wants to see hempcrete be successful or work with it or do anything at all should look at their liability and what their exposure is. So in order to eliminate that exposure, you need to do a $600 test. The entire industry is waiting on a $600 test.
But they know that, though, right? Or are they hearing that here for the first time? Is that the news flash here?
Back to legitimization again. Not knowing what the rules, regs, material specs, and testing standards are is the only way you can assume that those things don't need to be done. If you understand what targets you have to meet, then it's quite simple that if you don't do the test, its chances are zero.
Very interesting.
You can't start unless it's legal to use it. And right now, it's not even legal to talk about it. You'd have to be able to talk about it at least. And you can't even use the word insulation and hempcrete in the same sentence without getting an $11,000 fine per statement.
Unless you said hempcrete is not insulation, right? That's not an $11,000 statement.
Yeah, if you go to anybody's website in the space, you're going to see they're referring to it as insulation, and every statement is $11,000 fine. So and then if you read the R value rule, there's a whole bunch of disclosure requirements. If you're an installer or a contractor, there's all the paperwork that's mandatory that you must give to prove disclosure and back up the R value. I mean, that needs to be addressed first. I think when I say that it's impractical, it means that no one is willing what you have to do to become practical.
They're not willing to do it yet.
Exactly. First step is do the test. And, I spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to explain to people their exposure and the risk. And, I hate to be the bad guy, which is how I'm often interpreted, but you can't be the bad guy for pointing out what you have to do to be successful. Which is what I've been doing. If you want to be successful, here's what you have to do. And that's often interpreted as I'm the bad guy because I read the rules and regs, because I read the laws, because I've been on a construction site. That makes me the bad guy.
So like on one hand, you're like a voice in the wilderness with information that people need to hear, but maybe they're not ready to hear it yet. But on the other hand, I don't know, like cranky old timer with an axe to grind. I mean, I don't see you that way, but I feel like you could be perceived that way.
And often, yeah. And I think some of it has to do is they don't, when I'm explaining ASTM standards, rules, testing protocols, Federal Trade Commission law, they're not willing to listen. So, I usually advise them, well, read it yourself. I mean, don't get angry at me because I read it and attempted to explain it to you. Read it for yourself. And I've sent a copy of the R value rule to all the major proponents of hempcrete. And so far, no one's even read it. So you can contact any building contractor, any HERS rater, any energy engineer, and ask them about the process for installation. It's quite clear. It's got nothing to do with me at all. So if anyone were to consult anyone in the industry, like we're talking about legitimization, go to one of the people you would need to get their buy-in. The head specifier of a major construction company. Go ask him how hempcrete can get a building permit, or what the R value rule is, or any HERS rater that does energy performance in buildings, and get another opinion. And right now, it's funny to say, but I know that when it comes down to energy performance in buildings, I am, as far as a hemp guy, the most experienced person in the field.
And you're a believer in hemp, but you're not a believer in hemp's like magic, like the magic of hemp. You don't see it as a silver bullet to a lot of things.
I think we're going to find that hemp can do things that maybe other materials can't do. But we need to make sure that we're not backing a use that can't work. And the way you find out if something can work or not, like in the case of hempcrete, if you want to call it insulation, there is no alternative to doing the FTC mandated test. No one's done the test. So that's just, it's over.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous to even talk about it if you aren't willing to legitimize it. You know, like I talked to a block guy. He's got the block's kind of interesting. You can standardize a product if you're making a hempcrete block. It addresses some of the issues of variability. But, he instantly wanted to make it a international trade fight. And I'm going, well, yeah, that'll cost you $1 million in legal fees, and you have to sue the FTC, and you can't do that. The country of origin's trade commission is going to have to sue the FTC on your behalf. And, $1 million in maybe 5 years, that might be a viable path to try to get around the FTC law. Unlikely of success, but theoretically, or you can do a $600 test. The test is $600. I don't know why you would go to spending millions of dollars of a 5-year international process when it's a $600 test is in your way. Should
we do like a Kickstarter? Try to raise some money?
To raise the $600?
Yeah.
That's why I was so shocked. I mean, I spent so much time as the liaison from hempcrete to insulation, where the problem is at ASTM, and explained the whole deal. And the response was, instead of we need $600 to do the first test to find out at least where we're at, it was we need to raise $100,000 to change the international code, but the international code specifies the definition of insulation as per FTC. So to not do the test for $600, and instead we need to raise $100,000 to change the code that already specifies the test as mandatory. So what is the purpose? Even if you were successful, wildly successful at the IRC, you're not going to change the IRC code that says FTC is the definition of insulation.
Right.
So why go that $100,000 circuitous route when you can just do the test and then find out, how thick your wall's got to be? And that's the other major issue I kind of have with hempcrete. We're going to design a building. How thick does the wall have to be to meet the R value minimum in the code? Until we have the R value test, which will give us R value per inch, we don't have any idea how thick that wall is going to have to be to meet the R value minimum in the code.
Right.
So, to be able to design, specify, estimate, all those things can't be done. How do you finish a window and door? Do you need to trim out to a 12-inch wall or a 20-inch wall? Major difference in cost and material specifications in order to get that door jamb in that big wall. And we don't know how thick the wall's got to be yet. There's no alternative. Someone's got to do the test.
Yeah.
The scientific method says you may need to do multiple tests.
Sure.
To find out what works and what doesn't. So right now I'd say there's no viable R&D being done on this issue because it would begin with doing the test.
All right, so let's change gears a little bit and let's poke holes in other sectors of the industry. Let's look at CBD. I know you have a long history in the CBD space. So what are your thoughts on what's going on there?
Yeah, the collapse in the marketplace was caused by excessive overproduction, radically so. So for a number of years, we produced more than 10 times what the market could absorb. So basically, we produced about 30 years of total market in a couple years.
Right.
Now, being the first CBD guy, I know when this green rush or whatever you want to call it started, lots of people were jumping in, and they'd do a little homework and go, oh, this Bill guy, he was the pioneer. Let's just go buy him. And they would show up at my farm, walk in with a suitcase, slam it down on my dining room table, open it up with $1 million or $2 million in cash, going, let's go. Well, my response was, get that dirty money off my farm. I'm certain that I was one of the few people that reacted that way, and apparently all those suitcases of cash found homes all across the country. So it was obviously a money laundering operation. I mean, I know who some of the people were. I mean, it was skimming casino operators from Vegas, Russian mob. I mean, I can go on and on. Some of the people who stopped by the farm, it was pretty obvious who they were with their suitcase of cash. And that mentality, you know, they were trying to launder huge amounts of money. So their sole goal was quantity and nothing else.
Right.
And they were backing it with a huge pile of cash. Well, if you hire a bunch of, you know, back to the difference between supply chain and value chains, they all went total supply chain. Well, smart engineers can figure out how to move a lot of material. And so pretty much what happened was they were using forage choppers like you do to harvest cattle feed from corn stalks or whatever, and they mow the field and blow it in trucks and then hauled it to a giant dryer. Well, the problem is, and I'm trying to get a new group at ASTM to take a look at this, because once it arrives at an extractor or processing or bottling, you know, the quality specs are getting pretty stiff. You know, once it arrives at processing. However, what happens in the field and harvest and storage has not yet been addressed. So what that means is, and like, for example, one of the biggest, everybody wanted to be the biggest. You could see the trucks, they were all bragging about on their website, their new $5 million facility. And there was videos of the trucks coming in to the factory waiting for their turn on the dryer. And it's fall, and you can see the steam rising in clouds off the truck. That tells you what's going on in that truck. And we've done a couple experiments to figure out what the time window is. But basically, when you chop up flour like that, green, fresh, and blow it into a truck, you have less than 2 hours.
It's going to start to ferment, right?
It's total composted. That's what caused the steam rising off that truck. And some of these trucks might have sat overnight or over a weekend before they got their turn on the dryer, because, you know, harvest is massive and you're choked down to the capacity of your dryer. And you only use it for a short time period per year. So, you know, nobody wanted to overbuild, and so there was wait times for the trucks. Additionally, the cheapest dryers are direct exposure to natural gas burners. So here's a gigantic, many million BTU burner blowing down a long tumble dryer tube, usually 8 feet in diameter, 40, 50 feet long. Conveyor belt feeds the rotten composted material, fully composted, into the dryer, where it's tumbled direct contact through natural gas fumes, where it comes out the other end, and then it's stored for a couple years. So 90% of the CBD market was fully composted in the truck, exposed direct contact to natural gas fumes, and then stored for a couple years, often poorly, before it was extracted. That's 90% of the market.
Wow. So a couple of things there. So I think that makes me think that everybody should support their local small batch vertically integrated hemp farm, right?
Well, in all agriculture, the closer you get to the farmer, the higher the quality. There is no doubt.
Yeah. Amen to that.
That's why I love farmers markets. It's face-to-face. And the fun thing about face-to-face capitalism, it's the only honest one. if the seller isn't willing to look you in the eye, he can get away with a lot.
Yeah.
But when he has to look you in the eye, you can't get away with much. And so that's the problem with conglomeration and huge corps is, the seller doesn't have to look the buyer in the eye.
Yep.
So our goal here in Colorado, we're working to put together a certified organic farmers cooperative, and it's vertically integrated. And our guys, the past couple of years, were still over $100 a pound. When the market is down to like $3 a pound because of vertical integration and the quality. Now, in order to join us, my main mission in life is to help ag and rural economic development. So, existing farmers, so far, all those people in the CBD space, they weren't farmers. They were money laundering investors. So their mission was way different. When you talk to a real farmer, like go to your local farmer's market, what you're going to see is their mission in life is to see the look on your face when you taste it. It's not about the money. So those are the people we wanted to help. So to join us, we've got some rules. You must be certified organic. You must be primarily growing food for your community and practicing regenerative rotations. So if you're doing all three of those things, you can access our system that we've built for them. It's vertically integrated, and we give them full retail.
Wow. So what's the name of this co-op?
Well, it's in formation. We're the Fat Pig Society, and so that's our base farm, and we're a nonprofit, 100% volunteer workers cooperative is how we're registered. So we are a workers co-op, and everyone here, our mission as volunteer workers is to build that co-op for the other farmers. That is the goal. So we had to do lots of R&D over the years in genetics and genomics and nutrients and organic certifications and all the steps, the quality steps, how to harvest and handle in unique ways that can produce quality. So that's what our goal here was to work out all those steps in a new industry. While everybody else went to be the biggest and highest volume with the lowest quality, we stayed very small and worked on how to create the highest quality. So we and we mandate with our farmer members, it's got to be hand harvested, hand stripped, flash frozen, and freeze dried before extraction. So we're capturing fresh as the day it was picked freshness. So no composting, never touch the ground, no contaminants, must be certified organic, all those elements. So we're pretty confident we have the highest quality in the industry. And hopefully we can expand that. The biggest problem is real farmers are really turned off. It's like real textile engineers are turned off, or real construction engineers are turned off. Real farmers are also turned off. And they saw the crash boom. They saw the kind of people behind it who aren't the kind of people that farmers usually deal with.
No.
So there's been real hesitancy, and hopefully that'll change. I'm predicting a bit of a recovery in the CBD market sometime in the next 2 years. Plantings are down to almost zero, and yet sales of CBD, which is almost all from liquidations of that composted, rotted, natural gas exposed, poorly stored material, sooner or later is going to run out, and then it will return to the cost of production, and farmers can make a profit again. But it's probably 2 years away. So that's slowed down our efforts quite a bit. Because we are vertically integrated and the farmer gets the revenue, we are still helping a number of farms do well. We saved the dairy farm from bankruptcy by doing this. So it was a raw milk dairy. That was pretty exciting for us to be able to actually see a real farm that would have been lost survived because of this. So that was great. I'd like it to be a bunch more farms that we can do that for.
Right.
And, you know, I'm hoping that fiber with new processing technology can expand our reach to row croppers. Right now, our CBD approach only applies to produce growers. And that's how medicine should be grown. You know, CBD is medicine. It's not a row crop. It should be grown with the same love and care your salad gets if it's medicine, you know, and not, now fiber opens the door to their other kinds of farmers, to our row cropper guy.
Right, and grain too. We haven't really talked about the grain.
Grain is interesting. It's got some trouble nationally in markets right now. Plantings are pretty low, although there is potential. The one thing we found out is that the stalks from grain are not very good for fiber.
Right.
It's fully matured. So there was a lot of hope in the beginning that dual cropping would become a thing. If you're going to burn it or biochar it or make rope out of it, maybe dual cropping still.
Yeah, I mean, biochar seems really promising.
Biochar is the byproduct of what's fascinating. What would be fascinating is the producer gas. The cities that achieved 100% renewable all energy, their last problem was the trains and buses and trucks. And in both of those cities, Göttingen in Austria and Växjö in Sweden, that achieved it, the final step of all energy was doing fast pyrolysis to a producer gas. And the producer gas, Fischer-Tropsch catalyst over catalyst, made the diesel. That was a drop-in diesel that any truck, train, bus, taxi could run on. So that was a very high value use, and that stuff is toxic. So it needs to be captured. So biochar, to me, I see biochar as the byproduct of energy production with fast pyrolysis. Biochar on its own doesn't have a lot of the environmental and carbon benefits that I'd like to see that you can get by capturing the off gas.
All right, so this has been a really long interview. You know, we've covered all kinds of different topics. But let's change gears again. And so I feel like I can tell that you're an optimist, maybe. And I'm curious what your hopes are for the hemp industry, like your greatest hopes for hemp.
Yeah, what's my greatest hope for the industry? And fortunately, I got the Department of Agriculture here in Colorado to agree with me on a technology that I think is the most interesting to explore. And that is a biotechnology on-farm processing for hemp fiber that can also produce energy and do so at a really low unit cost. So back to the value chain type of thinking. The decorticator degumming of fiber appears to be too expensive. It doesn't fit into any value chain so far. However, we're looking at, there's been a development around the world, and there's a banner phrase that people can use if they want to track this new field of research and development. And the phrase is lignin first.
Lignin first.
Lignin first. If you put lignin first in quotes and punch that in Google, don't use the word hemp, you will see the research going on around the world that has decided to target the lignin molecule as the drop-in replacement for the petroleum molecule in all industries, chemicals and fuels.
Wow.
So if you look at the lignin molecule, and it's a fun one to look at, you know, you can pull it up and look at the different variations of lignin molecules and look at what is in that molecule. And you'll see that you have everything that petroleum's got and more. The challenge has always been that lignin, by very definition, is recalcitrant to mechanical, chemical, and biological action.
So define that word for me.
Recalcitrant is like, when you call a cat and the cat looks at you like, what? That's recalcitrant. So you can call out to lignin with chemicals and biologicals and mechanicals, and it just kind of looks back at you like, what? with almost no destruction to it. So that's been the challenge all along, and a good example to point to here, and these are some of the people that started this lignin first thinking, was paper and pulp industries. They have the same problem we do with hemp fibers. You've got to get the lignin off the fiber. And so paper and pulp's solution was to overcome the recalcitrance, the resistance to action, was to up the chemical game, just to get more caustic and more nasty, to raise the chemical nastiness to a level that overcomes the resistance of lignin to action. However, now you've contaminated and toxified the lignin. You got it off the fiber. So you got the pulp you wanted, but you made a hell of a mess.
Yeah.
Horribly toxic. And so some of the early approaches to lignin first were all in paper and pulp, looking for alternatives to the environmental problems. Now, that's greatly expanded. There's a number of groups like BioHorizon is one in the EU, and there's groups here in the United States, primarily at NREL, who are doing extensive work in the lignin first space. And that phrase is people who have made the switch from fiber friend, lignin enemy, to lignin friend, fiber is now a byproduct. So if you find a way to extract and break that lignin molecule up, that is more valuable than the fiber. And the fiber becomes a byproduct of replacing petroleum products. Replacing all of petrochemicals is possible with the lignin molecule, and it is the obstacle to getting hemp fiber to market. So those two things have merged. So my interest in generating revenue for farmers and my interest of cutting CO2 at scale have merged in the lignin first space. Great potential. Bunches of different ways. Now, I've looked at all the different ways of cracking the lignin molecule, and our theory that we're testing here in Colorado with the grant that I just got is to use some biologicals that are slow. So conventional industrial engineers who want an input-output continuous flow process won't look at some of the ligninolytic biologicals because they're too slow. But we're going, wait a minute, what if we could add time? And I came across some pretty extensive research that's becoming pretty accepted worldwide, where making biomethane from a lignocellulosic feedstock, which typically had fairly low production compared to other kinds of feedstock for biogas production, can be greatly improved by pretreatment. And they're touched on the same problem. Pretreatment of a lignocellulosic to produce biogas methane comes to recalcitrance of lignin. If you crack the lignin molecule before you try to make methane from that feedstock, you can increase your methane potential by 100 or 200%.
Wow.
So that, separate from the hemp space, is just the biofuel people after biomethane. They looked at the biologicals and same problem. It's slow, so they modified silage bag technology to be able to do batch treatments, and a silage bag is a bioreactor. So, and it operates at massive scale. A big industrial subcontracting silage bag are very common in ag. It's almost all animal feed is stored. can operate in the 5,000 to 10,000 tons a day range, to be able to harvest 500 to 1,000 acres and stuff it in a bioreactor in one day. So the scale of it and the fact that it's a bioreactor has appealed to a number of folks around the world trying to crack lignin in lignocellulosics for biomethane.
So it's in the silage bag, and what, it sort of cooks slowly in there in like an anaerobic environment?
Exactly. So what we're doing is cracking the lignin, and it takes time. Just like a tree in the forest, when it falls, it doesn't rot for years. It's very slow. So we're capturing that in the silage bag, and after it's been in there long enough and you open it up, we feel we can separate the fiber and have a delignified fiber ready to ship from the farm. And now the residual, the 60-70% of the field that was not fiber, has now been pre-treated, cracking the lignin in order to turn it into a great biomethane feedstock. So now that goes into a digester, produces the biomethane. We're estimating about 100 million BTUs of renewable natural gas per acre from the residue. And after the run in the digester, all the base nutrients are in the bag and can be sprayed back onto the field for a closed loop, solving the EPA toxicity problem.
Whoa. And is this a theory, or this is actual stuff here?
This will be the first project of its kind in the United States targeting hemp, although there were a couple in the EU that did target hemp, and the engineer is actually on our ASTM committee, so I'm able to collaborate a bit with him. And the biomethane production, that's pretty extensive. That's been done in a lot of places, and we're trying to hybrid the two approaches of processing fiber and doing the biomethane improvement all in one step. They're very similar. It could even be the same inoculants do both things. We don't know yet till we try.
When you use biomethane, does it then have emissions? Like, does that maybe also contribute to greenhouse gases, or how does that fit into, like climate mitigation?
Yeah, we have 1 billion tons of waste ag feedstocks every year in the United States already. That material, a lot of it's going to landfills where it will generate methane, fugitive emissions of methane. Methane is 30 times as bad for global warming as CO2. So we're looking at combining, of course, with some of those landfill diversions and our biomethane production. And in those cases, we can quantify how much methane it would have produced in the landfill. And by instead diverting it to the digester and capturing the methane, every time we burn 1 ton of methane that would have been fugitive, we get 29 tons of bonded CO2 reduction for every ton of methane you burn as fuel in an engine, for example. So it's orders of magnitude more carbon reduction than any other approach, because you get 29 tons of reduction for every ton you capture.
Wow.
And same thing in composting. You're going to generate both methane and CO2. So you don't increase it by having it come out the other end of an engine. It's going to come out the other side of the compost pile anyway.
That's really fascinating. So that's good news. That's where your positive energy is going in the hemp space.
Well, the hope for this new process is that value chain analysis says that we could compete with cotton fibers if this works. Wow. That we would be shipping something spinnable from the farm direct to a facility that could spin it. So that would make it, we've eliminated the decorticator, the degumming facility. It's on farm. The farmer didn't even need to buy equipment. The silage bagger is a subcontractor. And so the handling cost and the scale would make it potentially a value chain that could take on cotton. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. That would be amazing. So we should probably wrap things up here soon. This is a pretty long interview, but I think you've given people a lot to think about. But maybe there's something else you want to drop on the audience, one last nugget of wisdom to share with the good listeners of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast.
The main thing, legitimization, means that we are listening only to what the buyer of a material thinks, not what we as hemp people think. For hemp to be successful, we've got to be able to present it to a buyer of material, to someone who's not a hemp supporter, in a way they can look at the data, look at how we met rules and regs, the guarantees of delivery, price, all of that, and be able to show them in words they can understand and relate to how hemp can work better for them than what they're using today. That's the essence of legitimization and what we really need to focus on. We need to listen to the potential buyers of materials and listen a lot less to the myths that are propagated in the hemp space. Hemp's become a bit of an echo chamber where the same myths get repeated over and over again. And that doesn't get a buyer. The buyer already has his mindset. We need to understand his mindset, address all his requirements and objections, and do so in a way that's higher performing and a lower cost than what he's doing now. And that's the challenge. That's what everybody needs to understand, is it's not what we think. It's what the buyers think.
Bill Althouse, thank you so much for your time today. It's a really wonderful conversation.
Always a pleasure, Eric. Glad to be here.
All right, there you go. That was Bill Althouse. So what do you think? Do you have questions, comments, concerns about something Bill said? I would love to hear from you. You can email me at podcast@lancasterfarming.com, or you can even call me up and leave me a message, 717-721-4462. I would really love to hear from you. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online at lancasterfarming.com. Be sure to sign up for my hemp newsletter, and please consider subscribing to our newspaper. Oh, and a quick favor to ask, sort of like an experiment. Wondering if each of you could share this podcast with one other person. I'm thinking that if you did that, we could double our audience, double our reach, and bring the message of hemp to more people. Okay, thanks. Until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
Season 2, Episode 26 of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2022 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, which is part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written and recorded, edited, and produced by Eric Herlock, and any music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.